Welcome to another edition of The Learning Journey. Wayne Heinzen, your host, with you once again. Today we head off to Chad, and our guest is the Country Director for MAF there, Sundar Daniel, who joins us. Hey Sundar, welcome to The Learning Journey.
Thanks, Wayne. Good to be here.
It's very, very good to have you here. Hey Sundar, can we talk what life looked like pre-MAF for you? Because I know you've been involved in humanitarian work and development for quite some time, but give us an insight into sort of your background, because I think that's going to help us to sort of unwrap a little bit of our conversation and your MAF journey.
All my working life, I have been involved in what at that point was easily called Christian social work. I was also involved in training other people for counseling and supporting such people. So I did this for about 5-6 years. And then as part of the same organization, my responsibility was to set up networks which would support, which would motivate, equip people. That is, when I say people, I'm talking about Christians, churches. And then that took us to Northeast India, where we lived for about 14 years, doing pretty much the same thing, working with churches and Christian organizations to motivate them and equip them to respond to the needs of those affected by drug use and alcohol. And by that time, HIV was big on the scene as well. So it was a combination of all of those. So from direct care to training others, and then I moved one step further back, and I got into consultancy for programming for HIV and drug use, and worked with various agencies that would support such work. Basically, I'm referring to Christian donors and Christian and bilateral donors. I moved gradually sideways to community development, and I was working with organizations who were helping communities set up their own infrastructure, as in a road to their village, bath toilets in the village, or toilets in every house, those kind of things. I also was involved in Christian mission networking. I was working for 4 years as Asia Regional Coordinator for what is now called MICA Global, and I was working with them for a few years. And then came aviation. So yes, from drug use to community development to mission networking to aviation. But all of it mostly in program management, except the initial few years where it was working directly with people affected by various difficulties in their lives. That's the time I treasure most as well, even to this day.
So Sundar, I'm interested how one makes the step then into aviation, because you're not the first guest that we've had on the podcast that has come from a non-aviation background into MAF. So what was the step for you to join the organization, given, like many in the organization, you're not a pilot, you don't come with them from an aviation ops background or an engineer or something like that. So what was the thing about MAF that kind of really, I guess, sort of spoke to you?
The first time I heard about MAF was in Uganda in 1995. And I knew that they were flying to places which were difficult to access. I didn't know anything more than that. And then our neighbor was joining MAF in PNG. Our neighbor's husband was joining PNG as a pilot. So actually, my application was more as the spouse rather than the primary applicant. But then in the course of the recruitment process, it shifted from my wife to me, merely because I had some USAID experience. And in the Bangladesh program, there was a USAID supported project, and they were looking for a development director come project manager who could handle the USAID supported activity. And so that is how I joined MAF in 2018. A couple of years later, there was a suggestion they made that I apply for the country director position, which I did. And yeah, so here I am.
Yes, indeed. I wonder, Sundar, because I think that we pick up skills right through life, and sometimes they're dormant for some time, and then God will open up an opportunity, and the skills that we've acquired, we need to kind of tap into them once again. So I kind of wondered, during those years that you explained to us at the start of our conversation today, in terms of working with drug use and HIV, and then community development and the global mission network and all those kind of things, what were some skills that you've picked up along the way, where when you started working with MAF in Bangladesh, where you just went, oh, I've already learnt that, maybe in a different context, and I've got to kind of repackage it in a little way, but God's already equipped me for this role that I now find myself in?
One of the things that I learned, which I'm very, very grateful for, and I often tell my wife, had I not learned that, I would have actually had to look for all sorts of odd jobs to make a living, was learning about program planning, implementation, and evaluation. That was way back in 1994. I attended a week-long training in logical framework. And that was when I learned, I was prone to think logically. And yeah, I kept working on that, and it helped me quite a bit along the way. Logical framework now is seen as an old way of looking at things. There have been resources-based processes of planning. There's result-based processes of planning. All sorts of things have changed. But for me, the logical framework is still very precious, and it helps me a lot. More recently, I think I would probably use the word, the fad is theory of change. It's just the same thing, really. There's somewhere we want to get, and what will we do to get to that place, and how we will do it. So it's the same thing packaged and repackaged according to emphasis. So a donor who's very keen on results day before yesterday would say, okay, I want a results-based programming. Somebody who realizes that life transformation takes much, much longer says, okay, I'm not actually focused on the results. I want to see that you do the things correctly. So it's more process-based. So that's probably the biggest lesson in my life, which I have learned, this whole thing of logical planning.
And I ask you, you sort of touched on change, and I'll paraphrase, but you sort of said, things continually to change around us, and they are on a daily and weekly basis. Things are changing. And one of the challenges that people can often have is actually managing the change that's going on, whether that's them personally, whether that's professionally, whatever role they might undertake in MAF. So do you have any thoughts that you can share in terms of how to remain relevant when the world around us is changing, and to kind of flourish through change?
One of the primary things that would allow us to change and adapt to change is our focus on mission itself. Let me explain that a bit. If we focus on God and His kingdom, then we are actually prioritizing for that, and everything else is secondary. My experience is secondary. My resources are secondary. Knowledge and experience, everything is secondary. It's God's kingdom first. And then all these things get added to us, as the verse says. So that is one way of looking at it. The other way is to look at targets. How many people am I going to impact? How many lives am I going to impact? How many souls am I going to save? Then the whole thing falls on me. So I've got this idea in my head, I have to save 100 souls today, for example, or I want to see 100 kids less hungry by this evening. That's in my head. And then when it's not working that way, I get frustrated. I'm able to actually only feed 10 people. I'm able to actually share the gospel with only 5 people. And then I say, but I planned for 100. I have the experience of 30 years in this, in evangelism. I have 40 years in Christian social work. Why is it not working? I get very upset, and I don't want to change. But if I focus on the kingdom of God, what I do is just minuscule. Then I'm more willing for change. And that's probably my way of adapting to change.
No, that's fantastic. I love that. Maintaining that kingdom mindset is so, so important. I want to take you forward to May 15, 2020. the world has just been turned upside down. There was a pandemic, happening around the globe. And you started a new role, I believe, on that date as a country director in Bangladesh.
May 15 is our daughter's birthday. And May 15, 2020, I started work from home. I had a staff meeting. Mark Blomberg, my predecessor, started the meeting off and introduced me. So it was all an online meeting. And at that time, people were not as familiar or comfortable with online gatherings as they are a few years later. But yes, that's how I started it off. Here I was. This is a new role that I'm taking. I mean, we are in a pandemic situation, and I know so little of aviation. So what happened was I was working from 8:30 a.m. to probably 10:30 p.m., just working and working and working because I had nowhere to go. My wife had nowhere to go. We were just there. Thankfully, in Bangladesh, the office and residents were all in the same neighborhood, barely 10 minutes away on foot, or even less than 10 minutes. And so when we needed to go and get some printing done, we were able to do that. But otherwise, yes, it was very difficult.
So what was the hardest thing for you to learn as you stepped into that role? I remember talking, I think it was with Bastian Deval, who, when he stepped into a country director role, no aviation background either. And he said the hardest thing for him was all of the reading of the manuals and trying to get his head around all that kind of stuff. Was there one particular thing where you just sort of felt, I've got to learn a lot in a short amount of time when it comes to this new role?
The manuals were the big thing, saying, okay, I should try, and this is a good time. I'm at home, and I will read through all the manuals before the pandemic ends. And that was my target. Of course, I didn't get around to it. I still haven't. That's another story because I wouldn't understand lots of what was written, what is written, even if I read it. So manuals on the civil aviation side, and then manuals on the MAF side as well. At my orientation in 2018, they said MAF stands for Manuals and Forms. And it was only after May 15, 2020, I realized, maybe there's some truth to it.
Sundar, can you talk to us about closing the program in Bangladesh? That's very different, of course, than taking over from Mark and becoming country director. What's the process or what's the learning that is required to actually close a program?
Over the period of the pandemic, we had less and less and less flights, number one. And then at that time, I was thinking, what can we do? And then I looked at figures from previous years, and I found that MAF was being used less and less over quite a few years. And I started thinking about why that was so. Road transport, air transport, all the transport infrastructure in Bangladesh was being built up. And a strong reminder of that was the airport's advice to us to move our hangar from the south of the airport to the northern end because they were expanding. Number of functional airports had increased quite a bit, more than doubled. Number of helicopters had gone up, and medivacs, we were doing very little medivacs, and people found it easier to have a helicopter come to their village to pick up the patient and take him or her to the capital city. Planes would go to the nearest water point, but then there was the hard work of getting the patient from some interior village in a place where there's not much roads, and probably having a combination of roads and ferries. So we weren't doing much in terms of medical evacuations either. And then thinking of the kingdom of God, I was thinking, yes, we finished 25 years here in a formally registered situation. And before that, another 10, 15 years. So we've done our bit here. What are we doing? And that's around the time we were also thinking about the values of MAF in our staff meetings. And one of the values was stewardship. And the thought came to me, we are spending so much for so little use. We are providing a service of convenience rather than an essential service. I think that was my first conversation with Norm even. And I said, this is what I'm thinking. We have to do something about it. So it was completely a focus on stewardship. Where can God's money be put best to use? Surely at that point, it was in Bangladesh. And it was painful to communicate this to the staff. Norm and Stephen, and a little later, Dave Fayok, all three of them visited at different points. So two of them visited the program in February 22, and Dave Fayok came in June, July. And that helped to communicate this difficult message to the staff, because there were staff who had worked with us for 20 plus years, quite a few of them. And I was probably the one there with the shortest experience in Bangladesh in MAF itself. I had at that time been in MAF only 3+ years. So it was a painful message. And when people asked me, what will we do from here on? I had no answer. But then the focus was how best to use God's money for God's purposes, which meant the program had to close.
Yes. I mean, as we talked about a bit earlier, maintaining that kingdom perspective. And, I love how you frame that in terms of this is a stewardship question or a stewardship decision in terms of how can we best steward the resources that God has given us. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. I can just hear in your voice it's still a painful time for you. So let's fast forward a little bit. Bangladesh closes. You find yourself in Chad, in Central Africa. You're originally from India, so Bangladesh, relatively close geographically. I know culturally there are some similarities, but obviously some differences. But you find yourself in Africa, which is very, very different than India. When you sort of got there, what were your observations maybe in terms of those differences with regards to culture?
One of the things that helped us cope a little better with the huge difference was the fact that we actually wanted to serve in Africa. Between my wife and I, we don't know how the desire came about, when exactly. We can't pinpoint to a date or somebody challenging us, nothing like that. But it was there in our hearts for over 10 years, I would say. And when we applied to MAF in early 2018, we actually said, we'd like to work in Africa. Then when they said our immediate need is in Bangladesh, we can talk about this later. Then 2 years later, when the interviews for the country director happened, again, I said, we'd like to work in Africa. Again, the answer was, not yet, you work in Bangladesh. And then September of 2020, this was just before the conversations about closing the Bangladesh program. Stephen Charlesworth, then the regional director for Asia Pacific, said, you've been talking about wanting to serve in Africa. There are a few positions available. If you want, you may apply there. And so I applied, and then I was thinking of more Eastern Africa because English is one of the languages I know, not French. But then they said, would you like to go to Chad? And my only question was, that's a French-speaking country. How do we do it? But then, yes, if that's where God is sending us, we'll go. And so the big coping challenge was with the language itself. We are still in the process of learning it.
Yeah. Well, Sundar, I feel like that is a conversation that we could just continue on and on. I'm fascinated by it, but sadly, we are out of time. So I'm going to have to press pause here. Maybe we'll continue the conversation at some point for a future episode of The Learning Journey. But I want to say thank you so very much for taking some time out of your morning to have a chat with me today.
Thank you for this opportunity to share my thoughts.
It's always interesting hearing the learning journey of MAF staff, and a big thank you to Country Director in Chad, Sundar Daniel, for sharing his journey on this episode. And while you might not be learning a new language like Sundar, our hope is that you can take 30 minutes this week to spend on your professional or personal development, with resources like Elevate and Right Now Media being great places to start. On our next episode of the podcast, we remain in Africa and we chat with a young man who's learning a lot as an apprentice engineer. We do hope you can join us for that. And remember that when you invest in your learning, the sky's the limit.